Good afternoon, and welcome to this first event honoring the inauguration of Dr. James Neiman to the presidency of Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. We are going to have an outstanding panel on the topic of ministerial wisdom this afternoon, and we have some wonderful guests with us. 3 guests are professors from various schools, and we also have 3 alumni of Lutheran School of Theology. I'd first like to say who is here with me. Their bios are extensively listed in the bulletin for this afternoon, so I'm just going to give a one-line introduction. First, we have Nancy Ammerman, who is the professor of sociology of religion at Boston University. We also have Bishop Michael Burke, who is at the Southeastern Iowa Synod. We have Jhon Freddy Correa, who is a pastor of Emmaus Evangelical Lutheran Church in Racine, Wisconsin. We also have Yael Carey, who is the pastor of the Shekinah Chapel here in Chicago. We have Dr. Bonnie Miller-McLemore, who is the E. Rhodes and Lenora B. Carpenter Professor of Pastoral Theology and Counseling at Vanderbilt University. And finally, we have Linda Norman, who is the treasurer of the ELCA. Now, the way that we will proceed this afternoon is very important because we expect this conversation to include not only those of us who are here, but also those who are in the assembly. We will have 2 people present on the topic of ministerial wisdom, and then after 2 people have presented, we will turn to you to ask you to think about what you have heard and what you would like to highlight about ministerial wisdom, adding your own sensibilities to this topic. So we, in this case, think that ministerial wisdom is all in this place that we are celebrating. So we will begin with that. At the end of your conversations, I will ask if there is 1 or 2 people who would like to bring a comment. If you do have one, I'd ask you to go to the mic that is on my right and your left so that you can be heard and all of your comments can be recorded. So, panel, are you ready? Yes. Okay, so we will begin with Nancy Ammerman to be followed by Linda Norman.
All right. Well, it is really a delight to be here this afternoon for this wonderful occasion and to have the opportunity to share on this very interesting panel. It's a bit daunting to go first because, who knows what all will happen over the course of these next few minutes. And to be asked to talk about ministerial wisdom is also a bit daunting for me because, after all, I'm a sociologist, and the only thing I know about ministerial wisdom is what I know from listening to people like you in the research that I do. So I can't help but simply start from a couple of observations that come out of the last decade or so of work that I've been doing in listening to people in local congregations, in denominations, and in their everyday lives. So I want to talk about 2 different kinds of ministerial wisdom that are really intertwined with each other. The first of those is the wisdom to be able to help communities of people celebrate their own distinct histories and identities without erecting high walls and barriers that exclude other people. Very much the kind of theme about many voices, one story that I've seen emerging from the seminary here. Now, it's certainly not news to anybody that religious communities today live in very diverse and complex worlds, certainly not in a kind of isolated ethnic enclave. Our members come from a dizzying array of religious choices that are out there, including not affiliating at all. But in many ways, that diversity, that choice that is a part of the American religious scene, is fundamentally not new in that it's really written into our DNA as in the American religious history. It's meant in the United States almost from the very beginning that churches that in Europe were used to being monopolies and having the allegiance of everybody in the territory had to learn here to be one among many. They had to learn how to organize themselves, how to survive in this kind of pluralistic situation. And that meant that people had to learn how to work at forming their own distinct religious identities. And in some ways, the fundamental genius of the American religious system is that religious groups have been forced to celebrate their own unique identities at the same time that they recognize the limits of their power. But that doesn't mean that it's always been easy for religious groups in this country to discern what the particular thing is that God is calling them to proclaim, the particular way in which they're called to proclaim the message of the good news, and that message will find lodging in the hearts of the people who are around them looking for ways to order their lives. And over the last generation or so, indeed, that task has become more daunting. More young adults, especially, have left the communities in which they've grown up. They've gotten a college education. They've met a perfectly nice romantic partner who didn't happen to be Lutheran. And they may be in a place where any Lutheran church they actually happen to find doesn't look much like the one they left behind in Lake Wobegon, for which they may actually be quite grateful. Although I have to say, Pastor Liz sounds really interesting. But a growing number of those young adults are, in fact, completely unaffiliated, as we've been hearing recently in the news. The proportion of people with no religious preference has more than doubled in the last generation, and a third of young adults are now in that category. Parents are now, in fact, unaffiliated parents are raising unaffiliated kids. This is really a new kind of challenge that we're facing. And in the face of that kind of challenge, a lot of congregations have simply sort of thrown up their hands and declared themselves to be non-denominational and tried to assume a kind of nondescript lack of distinctiveness. But others have really bravely welcomed that diversity of people who've been coming through their front doors and have dared to introduce them to the peculiar way of life that is distinctive of that religious tradition. Well, the people who are coming through those doors from other religious and non-religious places may be very happy that they're not being scared away at the front door. They're also remarkably delighted to find inside those doors people who do have a history and do have a tradition. I would argue that the wisdom that I'm talking about here is not only a wisdom to recognize the diversity and lack of tradition that may be outside the door, but also to celebrate the particular identity that is inside. I'm going to be returning to that question of difference in just a moment, but let me just say a bit more about what that practical wisdom may look like from some of the research we did about 15 years ago or so now, about how that kind of cultivating of a distinct religious identity takes place. And the first thing to say is simply that people are intentional about doing it. They actually think that they should introduce people to the religious tradition and be intentional about teaching it. Second thing we found is that people are intentional about their worship life. They actually use the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer or the Lutheran Book of Worship. Or if they're Pentecostal, of course, they have a distinctive Pentecostal worship style. That distinctive worship tradition is a part of what's carrying the wisdom of the community. The third thing we discovered is that they're intentional about how they teach their children especially, but also adults, that they draw on the particular resources, educational resources that come from their tradition. And finally, that when they talk about their connections in the larger world, they are intentional about identifying their larger tradition and the connections to their denominational heritage, so that they dare to tell stories about what we Lutherans are doing out there in the world. So telling stories about who we are and what we do together is really fundamental to developing that kind of distinct and particular identity that is a part of the practical wisdom of ministerial leaders, I think, in the kind of world in which we live. And let me point to a second, then, form of ministerial wisdom that I think is really closely related. And that is the challenge, but the wisdom to be able to form strong communities in the face of a constantly changing set of people who are inside those doors. I've already hinted at some of this, at some of the challenge, but let me just remind you of a couple of additional things. Our congregations today simply can't assume that you're going to have the same bunch of people from one Sunday to the next, let alone from one year to the next. Among young adults today, a third will move within any 5-year period. Among those same young adults, they're likely 2/3 of them will have been in their current jobs less than 2 years. They're likely also to be in a series of relatively short-term relationships on their way to perhaps some longer-term relationship at some point in the future. One of the things we know, for instance, is that even with the most recent information about the unaffiliated population, the people who have actually married and, quote, settled down and had kids are almost as likely to be a part of a religious community today as they were in the 1950s. It's just that there are fewer of them. In the 1950s, 50% of households were married with kids households. Today, it's less than 20%. So that association of married with kids and church today makes it more challenging because there are fewer of the married with kids folks. So in the midst of all of that kind of fluidity and change, the culture is simply not making it as easy for us to form a community and figure out how to establish those ways of life, those practices in the community that will be sustaining to people as they come in and as they go out. It's harder today to convince people who are used to simply living without that kind of congregational community that they should find their way into your pews at all. You have to convince them that church isn't just about saying no to sex and yes to parenthood, or yes to the Republican Party, which is what a lot of them tend to think going to church means these days. You also have to recognize that community may not be defined by the geographic bounds of your immediate neighborhood. It may be linked by social media as well as, not instead of, but as well as the face-to-face meetings that you have. But in the midst of all of that fluidity, the wise leader, I think, is one who refuses to believe the propaganda about how one can really be spiritual without being religious, meaning being a part of a religious community. That isn't any more true today than it was when our fathers said that about being on the golf course, or our grandfathers said that about going to their favorite fishing hole. My research on religion in everyday life, spirituality in everyday life, has just reinforced for me the degree to which religious participation matters. A life story that has any kind of spiritual content and direction is a life story that is intertwined with participation in religious communities. There really are very few people out there who are really pursuing a spiritual way of life without the help of a religious community. What are the communal practices, then, that we should be paying attention to? Well, certainly worship and preaching is important. That's the threshold kind of experience that brings people in to begin with, that holds the kind of average member in the pew. But when we look at the people who are deeply imbued with a sense of spiritual presence in their everyday lives, it is people who are engaged beyond simply Sunday morning worship. In our research, the more people told stories about being involved in smaller group activities, having friends at church, those were the people who also could tell stories about how God shows up in their work, in their household, in their leisure lives, and so forth. So we're sort of back at the beginning. Today's culture makes it really difficult to get people in the door, to make the connections that constitute a community. But the practical wisdom of pastoral leaders has to then include the ability to be really bold in reaching out into the community, bold in telling people about who you are, willing to listen in ways that make the real initial connections possible, and lead in ways that allow a traditioned community to be celebrated, but constantly also changed by the constant circulation of the presence of newcomers and the exit of people who are moving on. Now, as an aside, I would note that this kind of practical wisdom probably also means that ministers need to be really good at managing conflict, but that's the topic for another day. Just as newcomers are being welcomed, though, I think the wise pastoral leader today is also going to have to be able to celebrate and bless that constant departure, creating a sense of dispersed community as well as gathered community. So finally, I think it needs to be noted that building these kinds of welcoming, distinctive, and commissioning communities is not something that we just do because it's a nice diversion or a civic good, although it is a civic good, or even that it's necessary for institutional survival because it is that as well. But the pastoral task is to invite people into a spiritual community where worship first introduces them to connections to God, fellowship introduces them to connections to each other, and service introduces them to connections to a larger mission out in the world. Difficult work today, but essential.
Thank you so much. We've heard some very important things about ministerial vision and what congregations and pastors can be doing. We now turn to Reverend Linda Norman, who is the treasurer of the ELCA, to talk about another perspective of ministerial wisdom.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I am delighted to be here with you and also celebrating Pastor Neiman, President Neiman. This is my seminary, and I have been formed and shaped for the worship of ministry through this place, and just want to reflect with you a little bit about how I've experienced wisdom in ministry. Actually been thinking about wisdom a bit because I preached recently at the Metro Chicago Synod Professional Leadership Conference, and our first text was taken from Proverbs, and it was about wisdom and how wisdom was there at the beginning of creation. Wisdom was there when God set the boundaries of the skies and the seas, and wisdom was celebrating all of creation. And then it says wisdom was delighting in the human race. And that text was connected to the story of the Canaanite woman in our scriptures for the day, and thinking about the wisdom of the experience of someone who has known exclusion and the wisdom of the experience of someone who cries out even for God's attention, the wisdom that sometimes is God's voice calling us into ministry with and among one another. And so when I think about wisdom and ministerial wisdom, wisdom is not something that we just have and hold and keep, but wisdom is something that's active within and without from us, drawing us into the changing reality, giving us ways to embrace creation that is happening in a new context. Wisdom grips and takes hold of us. And so when I think about the ministry, I call it God's love, active in story, creating new life. That's how I understand the practice of ministry. It's God's love, active in story, creating new life. What is not changing, I think, is that God's love is here and present and for the entirety of creation. And wisdom was there to testify to that at the beginning. And wisdom, I think, continues to draw us to testify to that reality from our place of a Lutheran heritage in this world today. I think with all of the tensions and with all of the conflict and with all of the power struggles and with all of the need, that continues to be one of the essential tenets and wisdom that Lutherans bring in our testimony, is that it's first beginning and all because of God's love. Rejoicing in God's love for humanity, rejoicing and delighting in God's love for all creation, I think is the first practical wisdom point that I have experienced and I take with me as I engage in my own form of ministry. Emerging social and religious contexts, whether it's in decline or in conflict or in increase in celebration, I believe that it's an opportunity for us to follow where wisdom is leading us, to see where is God active and working in a new way, in a new context, among a new people. I find that folks will engage with that love before they'll engage in worship, before they'll engage in any fellowship, before they'll listen to a word of Jesus Christ and what he came to do. And so I think about the practical wisdom creating for us an opportunity to have deeper reflections about what it is to be a minister in this world, what it means to be active and engaged. It's that first celebrating and delighting of God's love that opens up those doors of opportunities. When we walk through those doors, I think that's where the story happens. I think God's active doing things, as the Canaanite woman has shown us in her journey, that sometimes we don't even notice. In the story of the Canaanite woman, she comes and she needs healing for her child who's tormented by a demon, and she comes to Jesus and asks Jesus to have mercy on her, and Jesus stands there silently. And then the disciples are there, and they tell Jesus to turn her away, and she continues to shout and beg and plead. And I hear in her the voice crying out, even for God's attention, have mercy on us, O God. And how we as the disciples are called to be the one raising that shout for those who do not have a voice, for those who cannot cry out for themselves, and alongside those who do, not to be the ones who turn others away, but we also shout in the world for God's attention. And in that we find our place in God's story. And I think we invite others to find their voice in God's story, the place of what God is doing in and through and among all of us and cannot do without all of us, I think is the guidance and the love of wisdom leading us into the story of redemption. When I think about our Lutheran witness as well, the deepness of our theology that was born in a context of religious education. I think about seminary preparation, a place for action and reflection, and continuing to have an opportunity to deepen our faith and to deepen our engagement. And I think we don't leave without that, an ability to tell the story. That it's not just an ability to speak about the theology and the confessions and our heritage, but to tell the story in language that may not even reflect what Luther would have said. However, I do appreciate that what we've been talking about, the church-wide organization, is faith is a living, daring confidence in God's grace, and we are the church that shares a living, daring confidence in God's grace. And Luther went on to say, is faith is that confidence that is so sure that you would stake your life on it 1,000 times. That's a statement of faith, a proclamation of faith that people can understand, but they also want to see. They want to see it in the story that is lived. They want to feel it in the experience. You talk about fellowship, the experience that we have with one another. It's not that we've been lifelong Lutherans, but we've been life-giving Lutherans is much more important and critical, especially with young adults, that it be life-giving, much more so than anything else. I think in telling the story about framing what's happening in life, I think sometimes it's as simple as reflecting on the mundane things that happen in our life and what is the divine that is breaking into our mundane experiences. Talking about the conflicts that are happening in our experiences and how might God also be speaking a word of peace and reconciliation. How might we be involved in that? I think being able to frame our story in terms that are related to the practical stuff of life is what we're being called to do in this changing religious and social landscape. There are many stories that people are invited into through their engagement through social media or through their engagement in listening to the religious voices that are continuing to come through the airwaves. But I think it's the personal one-to-one ability to reflect theologically through a story that engages one another and helps them to interpret their lives in a way that's life-giving and meaningful is how we can begin to have practical wisdom in the way we execute our ministry. It's not just theology. I think we get so concerned about being able to profess the right words, the right beliefs, to be able to do evangelism in the right way. And I think practically, evangelism is just helping folks to tell the story of their life in a way that they can understand that God is active in that, sometimes through them and sometimes to them, but God is active in that place. That's an opportunity for us to be guided, not because we have the answers, but because we're always following where wisdom is leading us. Story is always contextual. It's always a challenge, I think, for us as Lutherans to embrace a changing landscape because we are so rooted, deeply rooted in a tradition that has been rich and has given us much, but also has been reforming and continues to need to be reformed. I think about the need and necessity for cross-cultural competency as something that we as leaders must always have and be continuing to challenge to refine our cross-cultural competency in terms of ethnicity and language, in terms of gender and age, in terms of social economic status, in terms of sexual identity and orientation. There are so many ways that our understanding of what it means to be a full and rounded human being is not isolated by one category. And how do we allow ourselves and challenge ourselves to be more cross-culturally competent, authentic with what we bring and who we are, but engaging authentically with one another and finding where is the imago Dei in you? Where do I see that in me? Where is that air between us? God's love active in story in a way that is life-giving. I think when we enter that place and that space that we're able to do that action and reflection together, I think that's when folks are drawn into a church building. All the things I've been talking about, I think they happen in church on Sunday mornings, but I think most effectively and practically, most of that happens outside of Sunday morning. I think when folks start to understand and experience and live that, then what I learned when I first started at LSTC is that we're on a journey of faith-seeking understanding. Then you want to know more. Then you want to experience more. Then you want to be drawn deeper into the story of Scripture, not just the laws of Scripture. You want to be drawn into the theology and the richness, not just the rules and the regulations. And I find we find place for deeper teaching and meaning. It is really hard for our young people to experience confirmation as something that is life-giving for them when it's just a teaching of our history or a teaching of the tenets. But when they have had an experience of church that is life-giving, that starts to frame and give some context to why the history that has formed this community to have these values, to be lived out in this way is meaningful and life-giving, they engage, middle schoolers will engage in a way that blows my mind. I think we have that opportunity not just with our young people, but with folks, Nancy was saying, who have grown up in the church and maybe have left the church, and it's not meaningful or life-giving to them anymore. to come back to that place that they maybe have been biblically illiterate because there was not that opportunity for engagement before taking Bible teaching lessons. I think we have an opportunity to speak about our faith, to tell our story in ways that are engaging to folks around a range of experiences, a range of contexts from religious experience and upbringing. I think we do really good contextual ministry as the church, looking beyond ourselves. I think about all the work that is done locally. I think specifically about Redeemer Lutheran Church in Minneapolis that has started a Glenwood project, which is a housing project across the street from the church. And the pastor there wrote a story about when he was driving to church one day, there was a for sale sign in front of this building that had been foreclosed on. And there was a 1-800 number and it said for sale, but it had been spray painted on the sign. You know, usually you see a nice bank-owned sign that tells you the contact information, but there was such disregard for this community, they just spray painted some letters and numbers and put it on a sign in front of the house that's across the street from the church. And that so enraged this congregation and the community that they decided they were going to buy that property and they were going to build a community house for young adult leaders to come and engage in ministry, learning from the community, giving to the community, and they've started to build this house. It's not a congregation that has a lot of money at all, but that saw a need and saw a cry out for what's needed in that community and said, out of faith, I will respond. I think that's a story of following the wisdom of what God might be doing that doesn't even look like anything someone would drive by and say, there is opportunity, there is a place for wisdom to be at work. But being attentive to where God might be turning things and us getting involved and getting connected to it. I think even internationally and globally, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is recognized as a leader in humanitarian aid, as a leader in ecumenical and religious and peace dialogues. We are recognized as folks who act out our faith in very public ways and very life-giving ways. I think reflecting not only our outward work together collectively, but also inwardly and claiming that as part of our own individual faith, as our own individual work, as our own individual story, is part of how we start to make those connections for people. I think it's easier sometimes for us to do than for us to turn around and speak about what that has meant. Why did we do that? How has God used me in this way? We get shy about that and we think we can't speak about that. But I think it's in that conversation and opening up that understanding, deepening there, that practically people will understand that and see themselves in that and see their opportunity. So when I think that when wisdom is at work in God's love, active in story, in ways that are life-giving, whether it's a small community or a large community, whether it's a church that is in decline or a church that is experiencing rapid growth, in whatever context, monocultural, bicultural, multicultural, whatever age group folks are ministering with, I think it doesn't matter what the context is, whether it has changed. It's that practice that continues to draw people into the love of God, to connect people in all sorts of contexts, in all sorts of ways, hearing all sorts of messages, but you feel a truth. You're drawn to a truth because there is an authenticity to our witness. So I just share in this growing up in an experience of a very diverse environment, religiously, politically, economically. I think it's important that we always open our eyes to follow where wisdom is. And it first begins with delighting in God's people and rejoicing in creation and knowing that that work in formation and reformation is always continuing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've had two wonderful renditions of what ministerial wisdom is, and so now we turn to you, the gathered assembly. There are many ideas and important things that you obviously bring with you. I'd like for you to turn to the people who are sitting closest to you and just have a 5-minute conversation about what draws you to what you've heard this afternoon, what would you like to elaborate, and after 5 minutes, I will let you know, and then if there are some bold souls who would like to walk to the mic to share just a tidbit, we would be most appreciative.